Okay, awesome. Well, hello everyone. Thanks a lot for tuning in. And as usual, I'm excited and appreciate the opportunity to speak at this meetup. It's always cool to get together with other AWS enthusiasts and practitioners. If you've tuned into any of my previous talks, then you probably know that I do try to focus primarily in the container space. That's where my inclination is. Copilot is, I guess it could still qualify as being relatively new. It was officially released last year, if I remember correctly. And so I thought this would be a great topic to cover, just because of how it makes, if I could say, ECS more accessible for a wider variety of practitioners, primarily developers. And I'll touch on that a whole lot more. But as you can see over there, just as a subtitle, it really helps with streamlining infrastructure setup and is great for application deployments to ECS. Okay, so just as a way of introduction, my name is Lukonde, or you can just call me Luke. A lot of people just call me Luke. And I'm a senior technical evangelist at SUSE. I'm part of the SUSE and Rancher community team, specializing in cloud native technologies. And so a lot of my focus there is primarily Kubernetes, as well as the Rancher open source product suite. And so you can always get in touch with me either over LinkedIn, GitHub, Twitter, or you can also join the SUSE and Rancher community over there. It's a great place for cloud native enthusiasts and practitioners. And as you can see over there, just on the slide, I'm 5 times AWS certified, also a container hero, and I'm a Udemy instructor. I've so far only released one course, which is called Up and Running with Containers in AWS. And so what I'll be covering tonight is also completely available in that course that I did.
Just mute myself.
Sorry, it's just a bit of disruption there. Cool. So I do want to just mention, sometimes people typically judge you based on the number of certifications that you have. But I hope, I do like to make it clear, I'm still very much someone who believes in continuous learning. So I wouldn't classify myself as a supreme expert of any kind. So yeah. All right, so what are we going to cover in this talk? Just going to touch on what AWS Copilot actually is, why you should bother with it or be concerned about it, and then I'm going to essentially switch over to VS Code, and we're going to spend a majority of the time actually going through what Copilot can do for you. I really wish I could actually do a full hands-on with every single command that gets run, but the problem is we don't have enough time for that, because if you've got any experience with provisioning infrastructure with CLI tools, then you probably know that it can take some time. If anything, the better the tool, the longer it will take, because there's a whole lot of components or pieces that it's taking care of for you, and all of that gets abstracted. But I will still at least demonstrate the different commands that you would be running and what you would expect along the way. Okay, so what is AWS Copilot? It's a CLI tool for Amazon Elastic Container Service specifically, and it enables users to quickly launch and easily manage containerized applications on AWS. I do like to say often that this is something that is primarily targeted at developers. And I see it as a great enablement tool, because if you think about it, not everyone is going to be working in the same role as an operator or a DevOps engineer, et cetera, who will typically be engaging with low-level infrastructure, setting up of your VPC and the various components that would come with it. And a lot of these components are actually very important and are pivotal for you eventually setting up your ECS cluster, the services, and everything else that will come in that particular space. So if you think about it, there are two main spheres from an infrastructure perspective. There is your networking, which is foundational, and then there's your cluster and the different components that would be inside of all of that. And I specifically didn't want to delve into ECS so that this doesn't become an ECS-specific chat, but I do want to highlight just how much this is Copilot essentially abstracts from the process of having to engage with all of those things. And I actually did a previous talk, I think this was probably last year, at the same meetup on setting up, ECS specific infrastructure. And I did a code walkthrough with Terraform, and there is, there are a plethora of components in there. And if you think about it, not everyone fits into that particular space. There are some developers who are essentially developing containerized applications and do want to deploy these workloads to ECS for container orchestration purposes, but they don't have a complete understanding of all of the nitty-gritties that take place at a networking level and at an ECS level, and all the different components that fit within that container orchestration platform. So Copilot actually abstracts all of that away. And when I speak to developers who want to deploy their workload to ECS, this is one of the go-to tools that I always mention to them and say, hey, this will streamline things for you. It gets rid of bottlenecks. Okay, so why bother with it? Just going back to some of the things that I just mentioned, it abstracts the provisioning of networking. Your VPC gets provisioned for you. IAM roles are created, obviously, because you need that for the relevant permissions. In addition to that, an ECR repository will be created for you. And I'll go through the repository that I'm working with in this particular case and show you how the different steps actually take place. The ECS cluster will be created, as well as an entire environment. So the nice thing about this as well is it also streamlines the process of creating the different environments, be it dev, test, and prod, as well as setting up your CI/CD pipeline. So if you think about it, essentially what typically can take sometimes even up to weeks, depending on your context, just to check off those different tasks, like okay, has the infrastructure been created for the application to be deployed on? Has an environment been created? Are the CI/CD pipelines set up? And maybe in your experience, these things typically happen really quickly. And obviously it will depend on the team and the level of experience, but sometimes these things can take long. And in many cases, developers are blocked from running with these things themselves because they've got a dependency on operators or SRE engineers or DevOps engineers who are more specialized in these particular toolings or solution architects. Whereas what you have over here is up and running with a POC can happen really quickly, but even a step beyond that, you can actually set up the different environments and it's still completely configurable. You can work with existing infrastructure like a VPC that's already in place, and all the generated configuration files you can modify as well. So, it streamlines things and happen, and you can essentially work with probably within an hour, and you can have your environment set up and your pipeline working, and you can just get to focusing on your application, developing that, pushing to the relevant repository, and that will be deployed. Okay, so I'm going to switch over now to VS Code. I'll close that and close this to reduce confusion. And just so we can start with some context, please confirm if someone could just say whether or not you can see VS Code.
Yeah, can see.
Okay, all right, awesome. Right, so this, again, the application is not the focus over here. This is just, as you can see, it's a bare bone React application. This is what we're going to be working with. So you can put yourself in the shoes of a developer. Let's say you're part of a team that is developing a front-end application and you want to deploy this into ECS. And so over here, I've got my multi-stage Docker file. And this is just building the image. And then after that, it is also pulling through the official Nginx image. And from there, it pulls what was the artifact that was built in the first build stage. And then it serves that through Nginx. And so what Copilot actually does is, for starters, you would run the Copilot init command. So I hope I don't break things in the middle of this because I already have an existing project, but I do want you to see this. Please let me know if you'd like me to zoom in. Let me actually whip this up. Right, so you'd run the Copilot Initialize command, and this is just basically going to prompt you with a series of questions that you would probably expect. The first one, let's see. Right, where are we? Okay, this might be because I already have an existing application, so I'm just going to go back to VS Code. So Copilot init would be the first command that you run, and then it essentially just asks you a series of questions prompting you for the name of the application and the type of the application. In this case, mine is a load balanced web service. And then after that, Copilot essentially takes it away. The name is very fitting. And what it will do is it will then create an ECR repository for your container images, and then it will then ask you for the Docker file that you want to use for your images, and it will be able to detect that you actually have one in your repository. And so you can select that as an option, and what it will then do is it will build that image and then push it through to the repository on your behalf. It will also then create that infrastructure that I was referring to, VPC, security groups, etc. And all of that gets provisioned. Once the networking infrastructure has been provisioned, it will then proceed to create your ECS cluster service. And on top of that, it will also create your task definition. If you're not familiar with what a task definition is, a task definition is just a JSON configuration file that defines the way you want your container to run. It specifies the image. So it does a whole lot of that for you in the background. And it creates this folder here known as Copilot. Now, initially, so you can ignore the build spec and the pipeline ones. Those are not created to begin with. The manifest file over here is the first one that gets created. Please let me know if the code is too small for you to see, and I'll zoom in. Let me just try and take it a step up. Okay, I'm assuming it's clear. So as you can see over here, this manifest file is essentially generated based on the responses that you give to the when the CLI tool is prompting you. Okay, so what it will do after it's created all of that infrastructure, it will then ask you if you want to create a test environment, in which case I said yes. And then once it has done that, it will then generate a URL, obviously based on the load balancer that it creates, exposing your application, and it will then be visible. As you can see over here, this was generated for me by Copilot. So all of this happens in the background on your behalf. And I will demonstrate how the pipeline works as well. And so again, just like I was saying, this is something that would typically take quite a bit of time, but this is all streamlined for you by Copilot. Now, once you've got your infrastructure set up and you've got your cluster running and your application is actually running there, so you can see over here, running an ECS Fargate. So my cluster React AWS Web Test. So I'm just going to click on that. I'm going to click on the existing tasks. So all of this information you'd probably be familiar with if you have worked with ECS. So it really is a huge, just a huge benefit when you've actually gone through the task of having to create all of these individual components by yourself and then seeing what it does for you. For example, even the task definition, because this is a big deal, because typically you're going to be generating this by yourself, but Copilot takes care of all of this for you. And you will see the similar properties that you already deal with some additional configuration. Like this is a much larger task definition file than I typically would work with, but just if you want to see some familiar properties over there, container definitions, as you can see. So this is still, you'll still see some of the familiar properties. You can see the port mapping happening over there, of course, because my React application is exposed with a Nginx container running in front of it, which is listening for traffic on port 80. So again, just going back to that whole thing of me saying that I believe that this is primarily targeted at developers, a developer doesn't need to have complete visibility or complete understanding of all of this. Obviously, if you know how things work under the hood, then you're better off for it. But again, it's just nice to know that this is not a blocker for developers anymore to just get up and running. Okay, so let me head back here. Right, so I'll just say again, like I was really hoping that this is something that I could have run during the course of this meetup, but I did another test run earlier and I just saw how long it was taking, and we were going to have a lot of awkward silence waiting for infra to provision, and I was not going to wait on the demo gods to see whether or not stuff was going to work, because I didn't want this to turn into a debugging session, even though there might be some of you that relish that kind of thing. Okay, cool. So the next step, once that has been created, To create your pipeline, you would then run copilot pipeline init. And so this works the same as the copilot init command, but obviously now it's obviously Copilot knows that we're dealing with creating a pipeline for the existing application. And so it will obviously, your pipeline will need to be sourced to a specific repository. So in my case, this is a GitHub repo that exists in my account. And so Copilot will automatically pick up on that and will know that that is the source. And so at that point, what Copilot will actually do is it will then generate these configuration files over here. If you're not familiar with what a build spec file is, a build spec file is essentially the build configuration file that code build uses for the CI stage for continuous integration. So all of this code is generated for you, but you can't exactly just get away with it. At this point, you do have to do a little bit of work. And by that, so in my case, because this is a React application, the only 2 lines that I actually needed to add were this one over here, the npm install, just so that all of the relevant dependencies can be installed for my application. And then I also added these, the npm test so that the relevant application tests can be run. But everything else is essentially already in order for your pipeline to run through the relevant steps of building the image based on the source code, pushing that image to the ECR repo, and provided that the build stage passes, it will then also trigger the release of that new version into, it'll update your task definition, obviously, in ECS, and it will also trigger the release of the new version that you just pushed or committed. Okay, so the other configuration file that gets built is this pipeline.yaml. And again, over here, all of this is boilerplate code that is generated for you. As you can see over here, the only stage that I have existing is test. And this is something that gets created based on the environment that you selected to have earlier when you run Copilot init. Just bear in mind, GitHub is not the only source provider. You can also use Bitbucket, if I remember correctly, Bitbucket and GitHub Enterprise as well. So just a gotcha that can happen over here. Just be mindful of the branch that you name to have for your particular as your source for your pipeline. So the default is main. On my local machine, though, Git still typically initializes it with master, and so I just needed to update this over here. So just be mindful of that. In your case, if your main branch is actually called main, then you won't need to update this pipeline.yaml file at all. And once you update this over here, in case you're wondering, okay, how does that then update with, how does that translate to the infrastructure? So what you would then do is, just going back to the commands, you would run copilot init, copilot pipeline update. And what that will then do is Copilot will essentially have a look at your pipeline.yaml file and update the infrastructure inside of your AWS account. And just so you know, Copilot does use CloudFormation under the hood. So it's working with stacks, and so you have visibility of the resources that are being created over there. Not to mention the CLI tools as well provides you with some pretty good visibility of the resources that are being created. So even though it's abstracted, it's not a complete black box. You at least know what is being spun up for you. Okay, cool. So once that is sorted, the next step is to essentially, you can then, your developers are all up and are ready to start just focusing on deving. They don't need to touch the Copilot folder or any of the configuration files in there once they've updated it with the relevant commands. So like I said, in my case, it was just making sure dependencies are installed and tests are run. But after that, you can then just update your applications. So I'm just gonna update this over here, say 3rd version, and just so you know that this isn't staged. So currently, the 2nd version is what is live. So I've just updated this to the 3rd version. I'm gonna open up the terminal. Let's call this a feature. New version 3. that up to the repo. And you can head over here to code pipeline, and as you can see, it's now picked up on the source change, and it's going to run through the next stages of the pipeline, the building and deploying to the test environment. And so that will obviously take a couple of minutes, and once that is done, we'll then switch over to see the change that has taken place in my React application over here. Now, in case you're wondering, hey, okay, that's cool for a single container, but how does it work if, if I'm in the context of, an application that, consists of several containers? I mean, that's kind of the point of a container orchestrator like ECS. And so what you would do is essentially when you're initializing Copilot with Copilot init, I think at this point I can actually stop sharing, but I'll definitely share again when the pipeline is finished running. What would essentially take place is it will ask you if you want to use an existing application. And so at that point, you would then say that you do want to use an existing application. And so Copilot will be able to run through the relevant commands for you to just point to the relevant Docker files in the folders, provided you have some kind of, let's say, a mono repo setup. And so if you've got an API or backend that's in a folder called API, your front end is in a folder called front end, etc. If you then have a web server like Nginx as your third one, then you would essentially just configure that with the Copilot steps as well, but it would still consist within a single Copilot application.
And if I add a container later
to the existing application,
yeah,
works the exact same way. So because remember, all it will do is Copilot is just basically checking with you. Does this exist within the same application? And since it manages the task definition, because what you would essentially be doing outside of using Copilot is you would be updating the task definition yourself, whereas Copilot is updating that task definition on your behalf based on the containers that you add.
So I can start with 2 folders with Docker files in it, and later on add a third, and it'll pick it up and and create the tasks. Okay, nice.
Yeah, 100%.
Cool.
Cool. Yeah. So it turned out to be a lot shorter than I wanted, again, just because of not being able to run those commands live. But I thought this would be a better approach to at least have people see the full life cycle of the infrastructure created after, as opposed to things stretching out and running potentially into some issues and you don't get to see the full story. So I'm not sure if there are any questions at this point. I will obviously just, I do want the pipeline to run, and then I'll share my screen again just to show everyone the update once that's happened.
I don't know if I can ask a question now.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I wanted to ask about the GitHub integration for private repository. Would that be like a prompt that redirects you to GitHub to do the authentication, or you need to get a token to do that?
100%, thank you. I'm so glad you brought that up. I knew there was something I was forgetting. So when you actually run the Copilot pipeline init command, what it will actually do is, because it's, like I said, it checks to see what is the source for this pipeline that is being created, and it will see that this is an existing repository in GitHub. It will be able to detect that, but you need to connect your AWS account to GitHub. And so what Copilot actually does is it will then produce a link for this connection to your AWS account. So at least it's not something that's too difficult to do. You'll get that link. You just have to click on that link. It will redirect you to your AWS account. And in there is where you're just basically going to click a few buttons. It's intuitive. So you're just going to then connect to your GitHub account, and then that's how it'll be authenticated rather.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. But yeah, very important question. Thanks for asking that. Pipeline is still running. The build was successful, so it's just in the middle of deployment.
So Luke, so there isn't any token that you manually have to manage and store in secret managers or systems parameter store or something. It's not all done automatically between AWS and your GitHub account.
Yep, 100%. So all of that is taken care of for you. Look, so you know, there probably will be situations, depending on how far you're going to try and push this and use it in your particular context, where maybe there would be a need that arises for that. But from a provisioning perspective, all of that is taken care of.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then,
So, yeah, go on.
No, go for it.
Okay, so I said, since this is target at developer level, I understand that you get an application load balancer out of box. Is there a way to connect that with probably your DNS server at 53, or doing a connection to CloudFront for caching the APIs?
Right. For the, do you mean using Copilot to do that?
Yes.
So I'm not sure if you'd be able to set that up in Copilot itself, just because remember, Copilot manages a specific set of infrastructure. It focuses on your networking layer because that's the foundational set. It focuses on the ECS components themselves, and then it does bootstrap what you would need for an application, like depending on the type that it is. So for example, in my case, the example I'm using is a load balanced web service. There are other options as well for a backend as well. And so that doesn't mean, though, that you can't still set up those additional components. But within the Copilot ecosystem, I think that doesn't currently exist.
But I mean, I guess, Luke, because I mean, Copilot is just, I mean, you mentioned it's actually CloudFormation. So I could then just have a CloudFormation template that imports, exports from the one that Copilot generates, and then I can build CloudFront and stuff out of that. Right?
Yes. Yeah. So if you're going to add to it, like with your own CloudFormation, then
yeah, kind of stuff.
Yeah. So
Cool.
yeah, I just want to make it clear so that it doesn't mean that this, whatever you create with Copilot, essentially is then isolated from any additional infrastructure that you would then create.
Okay, that's interesting. And you mentioned, so what are the kind of patterns? You mentioned load balanced web application and then a backend kind of application.
Yes,
So what are the kind of patterns?
Off the top of my head, I actually
It's fine.
I can't recall all of them. But what I have noticed, though, is look, they're actively working on this. The first time I worked with it, it was actually just there were only 2 or 3, whereas I think now you get about 5 different options. So as you can guess, they're probably going to keep trying to see, okay, what are the typical applications that we can try to bootstrap for teams to streamline things.
It's a similar kind of approach that I see them taking in CDK on the ECS module in the CDK. They've also built out a lot of patterns in there, and I think this is even easier than that. I mean, this is just looks very easy.
Most definitely.
Simple to use.
Sorry, Rand, can I just go ahead and share my screen again, just show people the pipeline?
yes. Are you struggling? Are you struggling to share your screen?
No, I'm sharing it now. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is the pipeline that was created for me by Copilot. Like I mentioned, it's a 3-stage pipeline, and it has passed successfully. Everything has run through the different steps. So you can see over here, this was sourced from GitHub. It ran through the relevant steps that I mentioned in terms of, after the image was already, the building of the image takes place in the CI stage over here, pushing to ECR, and all the relevant steps through updating task definition, etc. And so this is what the version was before. So refresh that, and this is the 3rd version. Cool. So again, if you've worked with the AWS CI/CD infrastructure at a relatively low level, setting up these things isn't that simple, especially just trying to meet, depending on whatever your requirements are. But to know that this is now accessible to developers is just absolutely fantastic, because it's streamlined, and again, I don't think anyone likes to have these weird bottlenecks with a lot of black boxes and just waiting for someone else to figure something out for you. And so this completely creates the entire process for you.
Very cool.
Okay, cool. I'm not sure if there are any other questions about Copilot.
I have two.
Yep.
I'm going to go ahead. So you mentioned the networking side of it. Does it provision its own VPC? Does it decide the CIDR itself and all of that? Like, how does that work? Do you have control over it or not?
Yes, so it is completely configurable, but the first time that you're running it, it actually provisions all of that for you. Just bear in mind, so like I mentioned, there's that manifest file that gets generated.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of those manifest files that are automatically generated are configurable, so you can change them to match whatever, the relevant properties that you do want. So like I said earlier, in the case that you actually have an existing VPC with all the relevant components, because again, there's no way AWS can guess what your, your networking requirements are. So you'll know exactly what you'll need in terms of your security group rules, whether or not you want NAT, etc. And so those are things that you can define, and those are specified as well in the Copilot documentation.
But if you deploy once, then if you change like your VPC CIDR or your VPC ID, then it's going to destroy everything and deploy it again, I guess.
Yeah, because that's essentially running, because remember I said under the hood it's running CloudFormation, so it would work the exact same way that you would that it would when you're working with your own CloudFormation stacks.
Okay. And tell me, how about auto scaling? Can you specify some parameters and some metrics to watch, or is it just the once-off container?
No, so yeah, all of that as well. Those are things that are also configurable. Some of them actually come out of the box. So in my case, with my cluster, CloudWatch monitoring is enabled by default, as well as container insights.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, my question, can I go on?
Yep.
Yeah, so my question is the deploy phase of the CI/CD pipeline. Is there a way to sort of have like green blue deployment or rolling deployment, or you get something at default? Do you get rolling deployment at default or blue green deployment by default when working with ACS?
Yeah, so that you won't, that you're not going to get by default. So remember that those things that essentially exist even outside of Copilot, like just when you're configuring them with ECS by themselves, those things are configurable with Copilot. But what Copilot does for you is out of the box, it will just give you your rolling updates. So like with the example that I showed you over there, where it's just one container, and then it will roll that out to the new version. So things like, more complex deployment strategies, you're going to have to configure that yourself.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Question here.
Yep.
Hi to the child.
Hey. Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, yeah, fantastic. Thanks a lot for that presentation, Luke. Yeah, Copilot looks absolutely incredible.
Cool.
So what I kind of want to understand is more or less based on the state file and how the state file is actually, or the implementation of how it's managing state. So is this with the manifest file, or do you actually see the CloudFormation template within your project structure locally? I think I just may have missed that part when you were showing your infrastructure being built out. So does it manage it just with the manifest file, or do you actually see a CloudFormation template in your project?
Yeah, great question. Sorry, dude, I couldn't recognize you before. How you doing, man?
I'm great, thanks.
Yeah, glad you made it, bud. Yeah. So what it is something I mentioned earlier. All you're managing is the manifest file. So that is abstracted away from you. You're not going to have visibility of the CloudFormation templates, and I think that's kind of just goes back to their goal with Copilot, is that typically your developers aren't going to be working with CloudFormation templates, because then that's starting to get a little low level, whereas their aim is really to focus on, or rather to help you focus on your application itself. It's kind of like a spin all this stuff up real quick and focus on your application. But what I'd like, another thing that I did mention is, again, at least you have visibility of those templates when you log into your AWS account. So you can actually see exactly what is getting spun up. And the nice thing is they're cool tools on the AWS side to actually see to have complete visibility of the infrastructure and stuff.
Okay, cool. Fantastic. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Luke? Nothing. Then,
just one last thing from my side. Luke, I can totally see this, working for us in terms of, it's exactly like you mentioned, getting something up quickly, don't have to involve a bunch of infrastructure, concerns and people. In fact, we're in a very early days of a new kind of POC, which I think this fits really well, just to get us up and going, quickly. But now, it's 3 months later, 6 months later, and you've added 3 Lambdas and 2 SQS queues, etc. So how do you kind of see that playing, once it gets kind of to that point? So, I'm totally on board with the beginning phase, make no mistake. I'm just thinking, what happens,
afterwards,
later down the road.
Yeah, funny. This is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, and it's that I think, and I hope I don't get in trouble for this. Even when people talk about the future of these kinds of tools, I think we're going to see more and more of them because, AWS and similar software providers will essentially be trying to simplify things and make things more accessible to enable you to focus on application optimization. But there's still a cost, at least this is my opinion. The cost here is that the more that you abstract, the less visibility you have of a number of things. And, like, even if you just think about the software development team, you don't have complete visibility of the trajectory of your project. That could get very, very complex. And like you said, now you're adding this component and that component and another component. And before you know it, it's this, you've added so many different aspects to your stack, but because you've got a bit of a black box here, you don't know exactly how well it fits in with that. So I think that's a challenge, not just with Copilot, but with a number of these automation tools. And I think that's a calculated risk that a team would have to take. And so, as best as you can, try to analyze where is this project going? What is what is the trajectory of this project? I do think that, especially when it comes to container orchestration, and I have been part of a team that kind of hit into this thing as well, where you end up switching container orchestration platforms completely. Because you find that you're actually looking for more extensibility. So that's something that has to be considered.
Yeah, and but the fact that it's still just cloud formation actually under the hood is a very good thing. Because that means, if you do want to, you could import some stuff out of this cloud formation stack and have another thing that adds stuff on top of it. So I think that for me swings it, that you can really start by saying, let's get up and running quickly with this. If we really have to add this and that kind of stuff later, we do still have that ability.
Yeah, and I think, and just to your point, if there's some, if there's a high degree of certainty that you're going to be within the AWS ecosystem, then this definitely, then definitely it increases your, I think you can be at ease that, well, we can stay with this definitely. And again, it's kind of, I can't remember what the exact quote is, but it's essentially, you can trust the fact that this is going to be actively worked on to address these issues, because the teams behind this are obviously aware of that as well. It's not something that's kind of like, hey, we dropped this cool thing. I hope it solves all your problems. It's this active development. And like I mentioned, they've already increased the number of templates. I suspect that will, I can be confident that will continue to happen as the project matures itself.
Cool, man. Thanks.
I think that Copilot looks a lot like what Amplify is trying to do for like that community, like where you have your front end and
Definitely.
back end, and it also runs off from like CloudFormation and
CloudFormation.
SSGLI. So there's like a space for everything. I just like shared a link there, Luke. I'm wondering like what you think about that. If you like, you probably saw that post that Corey made.
I'll definitely. I'm not sure if I've seen this one. I'll definitely check it out there.
17 ways to run containers on AWS. Yeah, it's crazy.
Right. Yeah. Hey, the more options, the merrier, man. The better. Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, when you mentioned AWS Amplify, and I haven't used that in years. I used it a long time ago, and yeah, man. Again, it really did, the context that I was using it in. It really did streamline things, and at that point, I had very little experience with AWS, and I just remember the teething stages were so frustrating, where you see, your terminals open and you get all these rollbacks because something went wrong with your CloudFormation stack, and I'm like, I hate AWS. I hate this thing, so. But when you get the hang of it, man, I remember like vividly on that project, I didn't have to worry about the infrastructure. Everything was essentially taken care of once we kind of got into that space of this is what we want. And I really could just focus on deving. So yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, I love AWS now, by the way.